本日は、宮下のお悪い中をお集まりいただきまして、ありがとうございます。この講演会は、一神教学祭センターまた神学部共催の講演会でございます。で、シスモは一神教学祭センターの中には、特定研究プロジェクトヨーロッパにおける宗教政策研究会という、小さなグループですけれども研究会がございまして、そのメンバーがこの講演会を主に計画をいたしました。でこの研究会では昨年度皆さんの中にもご出席いただいた方々もおられるかと思いますけれども、2004年の11月ですけれどもミュンヘン大学のグラーフ教授に来ていただいて、ヨーロッパにおけるグローバリゼーションと宗教と題してご講演をいただきました。そして今年度はですね、この研究会ではヨーロッパにおけるユダヤ人問題について特にメンバーで学んでいるところです。その学びの一環として本日はヨーロッパからですね、オランダから講師をお呼びいたしまして、公開という形で講演会を催させていただくということになりました。で、実はこの研究会のメンバーですけれども、ドロン・コヘンさん、そして奥様のアダ・コヘンさんのお知り合いがおられるということで、オランダでですね、ユダヤ人問題を扱っておられるという、そういう方がおられるというので、講師としてお願いをしたということでございます。で、今日のスケジュールについて簡単にご説明をいたします。今からの講演、何のための対話かと題しまして講演をいただきまして、そして3時30分まで1時間半、通訳を入れまして1時間半の時間をとってございます。それから10分間ですけれども、言語文化教育研究センター非常勤講師のミシェル・モール先生にコメントをいただきます。モール先生はこの私たちの研究会のメンバーのお一人でもございます。それから3時40分から20分間、決して長い時間ではありませんけれども、皆さんと共に質疑応答の時間、議論の時間を設けております。以上のスケジュールで進もうと思っております。それでは講演をいただきますけれども、その前に講師の紹介をさせていただきたいと思います。プログラムの見開き右側のところに本日の講師の紹介がございますけれども、エリック・オッテンハイム先生でございます。1961年にお生まれになりまして、2004年にカトリック神学大学、オランダのユトレヒトにあるカトリック神学大学で神学博士号を取得されました。で、現在はユトレヒト大学でユダヤ学と新約聖書学の講師を務められております。またキリスト教とユダヤ教との対話のための活動を行っておられます。キリスト教徒とユダヤ教徒のためのオランダ宗教会議委員会の前の事務局長、そして現在は常任の顧問をしておられます。タルムード研究を目的としたB・フォルカツマン財団の特別研究員でもございます。先生の著作及び論文についてはここに書いてある通りでございますので、また何かの折にご参考にしていただければと思います。それでは先生にですね、何のための対話かでオランダにおけるキリスト者とユダヤ人と題しましてご講演をいただきたいと思います。で、通訳をしてくださるのは中村さんでございます。よろしくお願いいたします。それでは先生お願いいたします。
Professor Mori Professor Ishikawa, Professor Kohara and all colleagues of SISMO, ladies and gentlemen, before entering the topic of this lecture, I would like to thank the staff of SISMO for inviting me to your beloved country, to the wonderful city of Kyoto and the distinguished Doshisha University. It is important that academic theologians from Holland and Europe in general get to know what is going on here in the field of interreligious dialogue and interreligious learning, and I consider it a privilege to share with you some insights and perspectives on interreligious dialogue. You can follow the structure of my lecture on the handout, so please I refer to that handout. For me to elaborate upon the issue of the relations between Christians and Jews in the Netherlands is to do that as a Catholic theologian. Professor Ishikawa has already mentioned it. Thus I speak from a specific personal perspective, which fact I am convinced cannot and should not be bracketed out completely in interreligious dialogue. Nevertheless, experience has taught us that especially in the Christian-Jewish dialogue, people are able to find a language which is founded in shared concerns. It is the improvement of society and the struggle against distorted pictures of each other. And moreover, discover that this language even influences the ongoing creation of their respective identities. In short, dialogue both makes people aware of their identity, and dialogue becomes a heuristic element in creating new aspects of religious identity. It is my conviction that we should not view identities as a once and for all given frozen structure. A religious identity is an ongoing historical process of being and becoming, of leaving and belonging, a continuous struggle to connect tradition with the present, to foster cherished forms and insights, and to discover or rediscover forgotten elements in the tradition. In this way, we are very much like the house owner in a famous saying of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, who gets old and new things out of his treasure house. This important study on interreligious learning in a global world with the programmatic title The Dignity of Difference, Orthodox Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs from the United Kingdom states the following, and I quote, "Every scriptural canon has within it texts which, read literally, can be taken to endorse narrow particularism, suspicion of strangers, and intolerance toward those who believe differently than we do. Each also has within it sources that emphasize kinship with the stranger, empathy with the outsider, the courage that leads people to extend a hand across boundaries of estrangement or hostility. The choice is ours. Will the generous texts of our tradition serve as interpretative keys to the rest, or will the abrasive passages determine our ideas of what we are and what we are called on to do? No tradition is free from the constant need to reinterpret, to apply eternal truths to an ever-changing world, to listen to what God's word requires of us here, now. That is what religious leaders have always done in the past, no less than now." End of quotation. The following topics.
Yes.
Present-day relations between Christians and Jews in the Netherlands center around two thematic axes. First, the memory of and reflection on past Christian attitudes toward Jews, in particular, the role of the churches before and during the Holocaust. Second, the theological discussion on religious self-definition. It is, in theological terms, ecclesiology. The first issue boils down to a strong sensitivity on the Jewish side concerning the ambivalent attitude of Christians toward Jews. The second problem can be phrased as follows. How can Christians address themselves as people of God, without overlooking or even negating the intimate identification of the Jewish partner as the first heir of biblical Israel. In the remainder of my lecture, I would like to elaborate and comment upon these two issues. In the first part, I will provide a historical view on Christian-Jewish relations in the Netherlands, both for the Protestant and for the Roman Catholic side. In the second part, I will discuss a recent issue in the Netherlands as an example of present-day discussions on the tension between religious identity and interreligious dialogue. Now let me turn to the first issue mentioned at the outset, historical sensitivities. In your handout is part 1. The present-day situation is the outgrowth of dramatic developments in the churches after 1948, which means after the establishment of the Jewish state, the State of Israel. It is no exaggeration to state that before World War II, most Christians at best were reserved toward Jews and unknowing of the contents of Judaism. For most Christians, Jews simply were people who maybe knew a lot, maybe were successful in business, but were needy of God's salvation as offered in Christ, and in that respect fully shared in the status of all Gentiles. In the few circles of those Christians who were interested in Jews and Judaism, this attitude was dominating, even if they considered the Jewish people as having a special role in God's eschatological salvation plan. Yes. Let me illustrate this by giving you a historical glimpse in a conference room somewhere in Holland. The time, April 1945, the last month of the Second World War in Europe. The most part of Holland has been liberated already. The attendants, highly motivated and religious-sensitive Christian theologians and laypersons, outstanding for their special interests in Jews and Judaism, and for fighting sheer anti-Semitism in church and society before the war. Some of the hardships of their Jewish Christian brethren kept in the concentration camp of Westerbork. Some of them have tried even to rescue Jews by providing with birth certificates or organizing hiding places. Now, in this conference room, the issue is being discussed how the returning Jews should be helped by Christians. As we know now, more than 80% of the Jewish population had already been taken out of their houses, been deported and murdered in the concentration camps in Poland and Germany. Unknowing about this, the attendants discussed their heartfelt conviction that the Church has to renew its vocation toward the Jews. The reason for this is that the Jews, as first people of God, still have to play a special role in God's end-of-time scenario. And they feel that the Church, that is to say Protestant churches, have to help the returning Jews by instructing them that they have to stick to their own religious vocation and not to assimilate to Dutch society. Assimilation only leads to estrangement from their God-given task. The secular form of humanism, as prevalent in the years before the war, has proven to be false, they say. Humanism is negatively considered as because it is a form of man-centered thinking and not founded in God. No wonder, they say, it had not been able to stop German Nazism or their anti-Semitic policy of separation and deportation. Some of the attendants even foster strong thoughts on the possibility that the German policy is executing, in a distorted way perhaps, God's own sentence on his people for assimilating or for not having accepted Christ earlier. Therefore, the best way to help Jews is to help them keeping to their religious identity by refraining from assimilation to Western liberal cultural values. In this way, the attendants believe, the Jews will also be more capable to hear the truth of the Christian message. Thus, the Church will be able to fulfill its first and foremost task. It is the mission among the Jews, which enhances the divine eschatological plan in which the Church will be reunited with the Jewish people and purged from its heathen heritage. The fact that by propagating the necessity to convert Jews to Christianity, these people unwillingly proceeded the German Nazi policy to annihilate Judaism as such, did not come into their minds and would become apparent only years later. In their own views, it was a real love for the Jewish people that motivated their missionary policies. One might ask, however, whether these circles really transcended traditional Christian teaching about Judaism. In essence, Judaism still remained a failed kind of biblical belief. The view that perhaps Jews did not need Christians at all to tell about themselves was even more remote. Let us keep in mind that the people in this conference room were suspect as Judaizers in the eyes of many of their Christian co-believers. Most Christians still held the classical view, as phrased by the church father Augustine, that Judaism had become obsolete after Christ. Augustine considered Judaism as living under God's wrath because the Jews did not accept Christ. At best, Augustine valued Jews as a kind of librarians of the Old Testament. Christian theology explained for the fact that Judaism still existed after Christ, whether as due to the stubbornness of the Jewish people, as can be found, for example, in the Gospel of John, or as due to a mysterious plan of God, as stated in Paul's letter to the Romans. Here, Christian attitudes toward the Jews differed. Most Christians definitely were convinced of the first explanation, the stubbornness of the Jewish people, and they kept a sense of religious contempt for Judaism as a failed kind of biblical religiosity. In the Protestant tradition, Judaism appears as a kind of, in the German word, Werkgerechtigkeit, a religion of works. According to influential Catholic thinking in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Jews appear as a dangerous social organism that propagates liberal concepts and immoral behavior. This religious contempt could take the form of social anti-Semitism. Let me dedicate some words to this phenomenon. A research project of the University of Utrecht on Catholic-Jewish relations in the 20th century has shown already that the negative attitude among Catholics toward Jews and Judaism is connected with an overall resistance against the values and political practices of modernism, that is, democracy and liberalism. Both Catholics, Reformed Protestants and Jews were struggling as minorities for their social and political emancipation in a society that was dominated by a coalition of liberals and the Hervormde Kerk, which is the dominating form of Protestantism. You might have heard of the typical social structure of the Netherlands in the 20th century, which was radically split up among the borders of the different religious and ideological communities. The Catholic attitude in this period was ambivalent. On the one hand, racial anti-Semitism was condemned by the social teaching of the Catholic Church. On the other hand, a certain social and political anti-Semitism was considered legitimate and even necessary for the purity of Catholic identity. This social anti-Semitism was aimed at the supposed Jewish influence in politics, economics and moral life. Catholic newspapers often equate, in this period at least, liberals and Jews, considered both to be harmful and even dangerous. The Dutch bishops issued in 1920 a decree that forbid Catholics to be in the service of Jewish households. In retrospect, these measures can be qualified as a continuation of the medieval policy of the Church to separate Jews from society. But one should also notice that these measures fitted organically in the dynamics of a closed Catholic faction that feared non-Catholic influences and that tried to hold the ranks tight and Catholicism pure. Anti-Semitism was to a certain degree part and parcel of Catholic culture in the interbellum period, but it was never virulent or dangerous. Even more, social anti-Semitism notwithstanding, Catholic political leaders, despite their ecclesiastical leaders, pleaded in favor of certain political rights for the Jewish community. The democratic liberal tradition of the Netherlands was indeed able to neutralize some of the negative aspects of a socio-religious purity culture so typical for a closed-in group that tried to uphold her social unity. Indeed, the language of purity, widespread in the era of the interbellum, and I might add to that not only in the Catholic circles but also in Protestant and other circles, the language of purity expressed a social ideal in which there was no room for outstanders, and especially not for those who pervaded all segments of society while at the same time upholding a certain own identity, namely the Jews. The second explanation for the existence of Judaism after Christ, which I mentioned, that it has to play a specific eschatological role, did get some popularity in circles of the dominating hervormde kerk, protestantse kerk, in the 19th century. Some Jews who had converted to Christianity tried to arouse discussion and interest in Jews and Judaism among the Protestant co-believers and churches. Isaac da Costa and Abraham Cappadoce gained some popularity with their eschatological views on the course of history, the place of the church and the specific role of the Jews in this Heliastic end-world scenario. They criticized the church for having become too assimilated to power and civil society. They also advocated a special mission among the Jews based on a thorough understanding of Judaism and using this knowledge to win confidence and gain ground in the discussion with individual Jews. This mission, organized by individuals, prospered during the massive waves of immigration of Eastern European Jews at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century because of the anti-Jewish riots, especially in Russia, thrived in the ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam. But its effect was that only a few individuals changed religion. Catholic interest in Judaism was rare before World War II. On the other hand, there was also no organized mission among Jews. Catholics simply overlooked their existence. There is one interesting exception. Some Dutch Catholics, inspired by a converted Jewish woman, again a converted person, who founded a worldwide organization, the Amici Israel, the Friends of Israel. This organization wanted to fight anti-Semitism, support Zionism, which was unique among Christian circles at that time, and work for the conversion of the whole people of Israel in their own homeland, Palestine. It is clear that this movement was influenced by Protestant Heliastic thinking. At its peak, the organization counted among its members 19 cardinals, 278 bishops, and more than 3,000 priests. They issued a remarkable plea for changing the anti-Jewish prayer Pro Perfidis Judaeis for the unbelieving Jews, said at that time in the Good Friday liturgy. They did it already in 1927. The prayer finally would be annulled by Pope John XXIII in 1957, 30 years later. The movement was, probably because of its pro-Zionist tendency, officially annulled by the Vatican in 1928. The missionary view toward Jews had the advantage that it understood and opposed the problem of ecclesiastical anti-Semitism. It also initiated the quest for real knowledge of Judaism itself. However, both the missionary and the dominant views on Judaism shared in what is now called the paradigm of substitution theology, according to which the biblical heritage and divine promises to Israel have been taken away from the Jewish people and transferred to the church. I would like to qualify this theology as a symptom of the Christian neurosis. Judaism should not have continued to exist after Christ, so a lot of Christians thought. And the very fact of its existence negates the church being the only people of God. Thus, for many Christians, the existence of Judaism negates the raison d'être of Christianity, and this fact has to be accounted for one way or another. And this explains a lot of the love-hate relations toward Jews and Judaism in Christian circles. The age-old Christian ambivalence notwithstanding, Jews had been living in the Low Countries since the Middle Ages and were no strangers in modern-day Netherlands. Since the Low Countries became a republic after the uprising against the Spanish king in 1568, the Jews that were expelled from Spain and Portugal after 1498, the Reconquista, gradually arrived in rapidly growing cities as Antwerp, nowadays Belgium, Rotterdam and Amsterdam. Here the Jews prospered and were able to maintain an own community life amongst the various Dutch religious communities. The type of anti-Semitism that prevailed in Eastern European countries and that periodically erupted in outright pogroms, for example 1648, the Chmielnicki pogroms in Eastern Europe, never occurred in the Netherlands. It was in this moderate climate that the ingenious philosophy of Baruch de Spinoza, the philosopher Spinoza, took form and was printed, a philosophy which aroused deep controversies in the Jewish community. Yes, there were sometimes outbursts of anti-Jewish religious sentiments, but all in all, the successive Dutch authorities always maintained a moderate political climate which fostered both social rest and economic prosperity. Holland was and is a trading nation, and religious zeal is not beneficial for trade. That is why, although Protestant religion, especially the typical Dutch branch of it, Calvinism, became the politically dominating form of Christian denomination, albeit shattered among more than 50 churches, it never took the leading role in practical politics. In Amsterdam, for example, other Christian and non-Christian denominations were allowed their own faith as long as they did not publicly profess it in a conspicuous, visible manner, and as long as communities subscribed to fundamental Dutch values such as tolerance and business as usual. This situation of practical tolerance was rather unique amidst the European politics of cuius regio, cuius religio, a principle established in the Peace Treaty of 1648, which granted rulers to determine the right to determine the dominating religion in their lands. When the Jews were given civil rights in 1796, this was less a radical change with a situation which was already established for centuries than in other countries, such as France or Germany. All in all, as a minority, Jews were able to lead their own life. The deep-felt sense of tranquility and legal safety among Dutch Jews would, however, turn out to be fatal during the years of the Holocaust, the Shoah. Most Jews could not imagine to be living under a regime that would plan its separation and deportation and even outright annihilation. To be clear, also among Christians, only some had a sense of what happened in Germany in the 30s and what would happen in Holland between 1940 and 1945. Since the moment of our glimpse in the meeting in April 1945, things have changed in the official churches, and I might say dramatically so. Even if there are still many Christians, especially in evangelical circles, that will subscribe to the missionary approach. In the first stage of post-war relations, the agenda was dominated by the discovery of Judaism as a living tradition. Judaism turned out to be not only a kind of living biblical museum, which gave access to the lost world of Jesus and his contemporaries, so Augustine, but it also showed a remarkable enduring vitality. This discovery was directly connected to the establishment of the Jewish state, Medinat Israel. May 1948 marked and symbolized a new era for Christian-Jewish relations. And it is no exaggeration to state that it was Israel and not the Shoah, the Holocaust, that triggered the debate on the non-missionary approach of Judaism in the early years of the 50s. Christians sought to handle this political phenomenon that negated the theological concept as formulated by, again, Augustine, that the Jewish people were destined by God to live in exile. Now Christians had to seek new ways of dealing with a phenomenon that was rightly considered, although it was political, to have high religious significance. Some had, and I might add, still have, great troubles with accepting the Jewish state. Others saw the signs of what they considered to be the beginning of the end of times. These Christians continued the 19th century Chiliastic model. However, a new kind of interest awoke in these years. Christians learned about the Jewish way of reading and interpreting the Bible, discovered Jewish prayer and liturgical life, Jewish philosophy, and, for example, Hasidic tales. Here, mention should be made of a typical Dutch phenomenon, although it is founded on its forerunners in Frankfurt as Vrije Jüdische Leerhaus, the so-called learning houses, a kind of what in Hebrew is called Beit HaMidrash, the name for a traditional Jewish learning place, but in most places functioning in a Christian context. They have become places where Christians as well as Jews reflect on biblical texts, on Jewish tradition, and reflect on Jewish-Christian relations on a fundamental level. The overall ideology of learning houses is not to become a kind of Jews, but to learn from Judaism how to be better Christians. And of course, the fact that Christianity is rooted in Judaism plays a very important role in this respect. They focus, for example, on studying the Jewish heritage in Christianity, the writings of the New Testament, for example, Jesus as a Jewish teacher in first century Judaism. Jewish teachers, scholars and rabbis played a significant role in this process. Mostly initiated by Protestants, learning houses are also attended by Catholics. In this respect, learning houses have a special ecumenical quality. From their beginning in the 60s, these grassroots initiatives have shaped a deep awareness among believers of many churches of the importance of Judaism for Christian identity and Judaism as such. Compared with Protestants, with their almost natural focus on Bible and biblical theology, Catholics seem less influenced by this phenomenon. In the second stage, from the early 80s onwards up till now, the catastrophic experiences of the Dutch Jewish community during the Second World War gradually were brought to the fore. I think there is a kind of parallel with the situation in the United States, where a TV series called Holocaust triggered a national debate on the Holocaust in the 70s and early 80s. In Holland, it was especially the documentary of the famous French cineast Claude Lanzmann called Shoah from 1986 that led to new debates on the causes and effects of the Holocaust. But now, and I'm using the famous triangle of the Shoah scholar Raoul Hilberg, it were not only the victims or the perpetrators that were given attention to, as in the era of the Eichmann trial in Israel, but most and for all the bystanders, which also means the Christians and Christian churches. It is important to realize that the hard fact that in percentage, Dutch Jewry suffered the highest amount of victims apart from Poland. 103,000 souls, more than 80% of pre-war Judaism. The reasons for this extremely high percentage of victims in a relatively liberal country are manifold. One is the problem of hiding in a flat and densely populated country. Another one is the well-organized bureaucracy in the Netherlands. Also the fact that Holland was occupied by an SS regime and not by the regular Wehrmacht played a significant role. But this is history. If we are to qualify what seems to be the pivot of historical experience of people in present-day Jewish community, when it concerns the Shoah and the non-Jewish world, and especially the churches, it is the trauma of a loss of feeling of security. As I mentioned earlier, until 1940, Dutch Jews cherished a great trust in civil society and in the government. Some scholars even speak of a political naivety of Dutch Jewry. Since Napoleon, no war had ever visited this small country, and the Jews had not experienced threats nor persecutions by the subsequent government. So the Jews were less alarmed by the threat of Nazism than, for example, their German and, moreover, their Eastern European counterparts. We must mention with respect the courageous protests by the Dutch bishops against the deportation of Jews in 1942. Here the moral strength and brave character of an individual, Archbishop and later Cardinal de Jong, proved to be decisive. The impression remains, however, that people like de Jong were the exception on the rule, that church policies had failed before and also during the Holocaust. As mentioned at the beginning, even the most pro-Jewish church organization, the Hervormde Raad voor Kerk in Israel, those people who discussed mission, they were discussing the best strategy to maintain mission among the Jews after the war. Yes, there were Christians who hid Jews and Jewish children. In general, however, Jews felt left alone by their Christian fellow men during the darkest hours of their history, and even after their return from the camps. This trauma is still felt, and it bursts out on the surface on many occasions in present-day relations, even if in Christian eyes there does not seem to be a justification. A good example for this are the reactions within Dutch Jewry to criticism of the policies of the State of Israel. The Shoah has put criticism of the Jewish state under the suspense of anti-Semitism. I am not evaluating whether this is a correct evaluation or a distortion of reality, but the sensitivities are there. Now we are at the second part of the handout.
皆さんのお手元の資料の第2部のところに入っています。
There does not seem to be neutral ground for interreligious dialogue, as I mentioned at the beginning. That remark can surely be made with regards to the second issue, ecclesiological thinking coram Judaios, which is Latin and means thinking our identity as a church when facing the Jewish people. It was the Second Vatican Council in October 1965, 15 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, that officially and for the first time since the Apostle Paul changed the traditional view on Judaism as an obsolete religion. 15 lines of church Latin contained in the Conciliar Declaration Nostra Aetate, chapter 4, would herald a new era of Catholic-Jewish relations. Nostra Aetate teaches that the Jews cannot be held responsible for the execution of Jesus Christ, and states positively that God has not renounced his covenant with the people of Abraham. Interestingly, Nostra Aetate does not explain for the existence of the Jewish people after Christ in terms of an eschatological plan. Moreover, our relation to Judaism, Nostra Aetate states, is inherent to the way we look at ourselves as a church. That is, it is inherent to the mystery of the church. I consider this teaching, in fact, the opening sentence of the 4th chapter of Nostra Aetate, to be the principal point of departure for any Catholic theology. One can rephrase this with the famous sentence, "Tell me your vision on Judaism, and I'll tell you who you are." However, if we look back to post-conciliar developments in Catholic theology in general, and also for the Protestant theology, this is a point that can be made, it is surprising to notice that ecclesiology is only barely influenced by the new theology on Judaism. It is stated merely what one cannot say anymore, but it is not stated what one can or should say. God has not regretted his covenant with the Jewish people, but the church is the new people of God, and how we have to think both realities, the church as a new people of God and the Jewish people as the people of God, does not seem to pose a major problem. But it does. It takes a detail to trigger a discussion where all questions pop up simultaneously. The two issues I presented as the axis of Christian-Jewish relations, it is historical sensibilities on the Jewish side and Christian side, and the theological identification as people of God, they were the pivotal points of a case which was and still is disputed in the Netherlands from 1999 onwards, the improperia of the Good Friday liturgy. This dispute clearly illustrates the present state of Jewish-Christian dialogue in the Netherlands. Therefore, in the last part of my lecture, I will touch on some of the elements of this dispute, and you can follow the text of the prayer at your handout. Improperia is a name of a famous and important prayer in the Roman Catholic liturgy of the veneration of the cross during Good Friday, the day when the death of Christ is being commemorated. We must keep in mind that Good Friday in the past was an occasion of many anti-Jewish riots in Christian communities. Ironically, it was the initiative of liturgical experts of Protestant origin to introduce a certain form of the improperia in a new liturgical order of the three biggest Protestant churches, and not the age-old tradition in the Catholic Church that triggered the discussion. Some ministers and theologians in the Protestant churches protested to this initiative. They stipulated that the text of the improperia ventilated old anti-Jewish theology, according to which it was the Jewish people that had refused the grace of God and even had killed Christ. Now let us take a closer look at the beginning of the prayer. So we'll take a look at the beginning of the prayer, and it is on your handout, both in the Latin original version and in an English translation. My people, what have I done to you? Or in what did I contravene you? Answer me. Because I took you out from Egypt, you have prepared a cross for your Savior. Holy God, holy stronghold, because I have led you through the desert for 40 years and fed you with the bread from heaven, manna, and led you into a land filled with good, you have prepared a cross for your Savior. Holy God, holy stronghold, holy immortal one, have mercy upon us. Holy immortal one, have mercy upon us. This is only the start of a long prayer. The text goes on with 9 more examples of God's redemptive actions, followed by the repeated invocation of God, and the theme, my people, what have I done to you? The prayer is placed in a rite called the Veneration of the Cross. Let us look at the structure of the text. Relating elements of the biblical history of the redemption of Israel from Egypt, the text contrasts divine actions of liberation in the Old Testament with the torture and the killing of Christ in the New Testament. The opponents of the text pointed to the alleged anti-Jewish character of the text. According to them, the text puts the blame of the torturing and killing of Christ to the Jewish people. So the Jewish partners in the consultative body of Christians and Jews in the Netherlands took up this challenge and declared their anger with this text. They had two reasons for their protest. First, liturgical symbolism expresses a certain perception of reality and at the same time shapes this perception. The problem with the text is that Jews in the text figure in a negative role model, a symbol for human sinfulness. The text indeed uses the motive of the stubborn Jewish people as a negative contrast for the liberating acts of God. Besides, they asked, does the church claim that it is she who has been led out of Egypt, that it was she that has benefited from God's salvific act through Moses in the desert? Does the church thus claim to be the true Israel instead of the Jewish people itself? Here the dispute touched upon an open question that was probably never formulated so openly and explicitly before. How and why does the church claim to be the heir of the biblical Israel? And what then about the physical Israel, the carnal Israel? Let me give you some of my thoughts about the improperia. First, the issue of the intention of the text. In itself, it seems to me that the text connects both the acts of torture and the complaint to the assembled believers who pray or mostly sing the text. The threefold repetition of the invoking of God's mercy upon us underlines this interpretation. But if the improperia do not relate to the Jewish people, another problem pops up. Then it relates directly to the church as a party that has been saved by God in the desert and that now, through sins, crucifies Christ. But here the second argument seems to come into effect. This can only be upheld if we overlook the existence of the Jewish people, for whom these salvific acts of the Old Testament are part of their national history and religious identity. I repeat, the reproaches of the text of course must be aimed at the Christian believers themselves. But if this is so, the second problem arises that the church identifies directly with the biblical Israel and assumes a self-definition that is absolute. Of course, if it are the Jews that are the object of the text and the reproaches, we have a clear instance of anti-Judaism, and there are older text versions that prove that this is a possibility. But even if the improperia can be said without anti-Jewish sentiments, they have their origins, the prayer has its origins in a theology of substitution. If this is true, and I think it is, then the church cannot utter these words without hesitation or stuttering. The church never hesitated to use images and concepts of the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, to express her own identity. And indeed, we have to do it if we do not want to take the radical stance of Marcion, who proposed a Christianity without the Old Testament. But from the perspective of the Jewish partner, by reading the text like the improperia, we share in the utmost intimacy without consent of the other partner. Confronted with what is felt like an usurpation, the immediate question on the Jewish side arises, what are you doing with my love letters? Indeed, what does this mean for our validation of Judaism? Do we try to reconcile both claims, or do we just accept the incompatibility of a theological validation of Judaism on the one hand and a Christological self-affirmation of the Church on the other side? Now the answer that is no longer satisfying is the one given by Augustine again. to say we are Israelites in a pure spiritual sense. How legitimate this answer may have been for them in that time, how influential it still proves to be, the inherent Neoplatonic opposition body-soul with this implicit hierarchy is no longer acceptable. Also no longer acceptable is the notion of the church as a tertium genus, a third race beside Jews and Gentiles, as the German theologian Friedrich Wilhelm Marquardt, pupil of Karl Barth, rightly has said. The question on the improperia has not been finished, nor put to the satisfying conclusion. Maybe that is for the better, because there is no simple whether-or. Neither is there a kind of neutral zone. There is a church and there is a living Jewish community, and there is a relation between the two of them. But there is no such thing as a common tradition, and nor do we play a part in a divine comedy. Or maybe we do, but then, in the words of Paul...
Could you skip a lot?
Yes, I skipped a little bit, yes.
Yes,
Whole paragraph.
Where did you start?
The discussion.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Maybe we do play a part in a divine comedy, but then, with the words of the Apostle Paul, we only look in the riddles of a divine mystery which we cannot solve.
しかし、インプロペリアについての議論というのは、決して終わるものではないし、また、満足のできるような結論を出すこともできないもので。
Jews and Christians, I skip to page 13, Jews and Christians struggle to maintain and renew their identities. Interreligious dialogue has become an important element in this struggle. It may pose serious and sometimes painful questions. However, at least for the Christian side, it is indispensable. Jews pose intriguing questions we should not pass by lightly. The Christian claim to be a partner in God's struggle for the redemption should not be brought to the fore on the expense of the Jews and their religious intimacy. On the other hand, the meeting with the Jews and the discovery of the theological depth and richness of Jewish tradition may be perceived as a revelatory experience, or, in the words of Acts 5, New Testament, as a work from God, according to the words of the Pharisaic teacher Rabban Gamliel. Our identity may get new shape and form in and throughout this meeting. If we are like two communities in a controversy for the sake of heaven, only God knows what miracles we may achieve. Thank you very much for your kind attention.